All right, so we've gone through the three sections of the balance sheet: assets, what you own; liabilities, what you owe; and shareholders' equity, the residual value or the owner's equity in the firm. I want to go through the common size balance sheet for these two firms and see if we can see some similarities or differences. All right, so Tiffany's jewelry chain, etc., 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 Flowers Foods is basically a bread maker. If we go in here and look at the assets, here's some things that really leap out immediately. Tiffany's inventory is huge relative to Flowers Foods. Okay, that sort of makes sense because how long can you leave bread sitting on the shelf? Once they make the bread, they need to sell it. They make new bread all the time. A little different for jewelry. It can sit on the shelf for a while, although in fact, jewelry does go bad. It goes out of fashion. And if you read through the 10K, Tiffany actually discusses that, where they have an allowance for obsolescence. If they go and make coronavirus hearts, and then everybody gets pissed off and doesn't want to buy coronavirus hearts, they won't be able to sell the inventory, and so they can actually have it become obsolescent or lose value. So they actually set aside reserves for that sort of thing. All right, so a couple other things to really note. First of all, current assets are huge over at Tiffany and very low over at Flowers Foods. Relatively low receivables as a percent of assets. Now remember, as a percent of assets is not the same as dollar-wise. If we go over here at dollar-wise, the accounts receivable for these two firms are almost the same, right? Around $250, $275 million. The thing is, though, that the total assets is so much different. For Tiffany's, you're looking at 6.6 billion, and for Flowers Foods, you're looking at 3.17 billion. So when you start taking that Flowers Foods 285 million as a percentage of half as many assets, it makes the number look a little bit larger. Okay, so remember that when we're doing common size balance sheet, all the numbers have been divided by assets this time, and so everything's a percentage of assets. What we can tell is current assets are a much bigger part of the Tiffany's asset mix than they are the Flower Foods. And with Tiffany's, the big part is inventory. All right, it's 45%, and the inventory didn't actually drop. It's just that they added all those new other assets that they hadn't been reporting before. The lease right of use assets, that was zero, and then all of a sudden they started reporting $1 billion worth. If we go back up here and look at what happened with inventory, Tiffany's inventory was $2.5 billion last year, and this year it hadn't changed a lick. And Flowers Foods inventory, roughly $125,000. So that's one of the first things that leaps out. Tiffany's higher on cash and hugely higher on inventory. And then conversely, if we look at net property, plant, and equipment, Tiffany has a lot of what you call leasehold improvements. When you lease a building, you do not own it. But if you lease it and the owner of the building allows you to put up a sign that says Tiffany's and put up security systems and all that other stuff, then you own the leasehold improvements. You just don't own the building. So Tiffany's does a lot of their stuff through other stores. For instance, they'll open a kiosk or a selling area in a major department store. And so the stuff they add in there, they still own and get to take with them, but they don't own the building. Conversely, over here at Flowers Foods, a lot of their assets are taken up with building And machinery and equipment. They got to have some place to bake all that bread, and that's where that comes in. As a percentage of assets, these are actually large numbers. Notice that the accumulated depreciation, though, strips a lot of that right back out. So 63% of assets are gross property, plant, and equipment. The accumulated depreciation on those assets is 40% of the value of the assets. So you end up with a lot lower proportion. And then we look at the lease activities. We see Goodwill in here. Flowers Foods has a lot of goodwill in their balance sheet. Goodwill arises from buying another firm for higher than the financial statement value. And, you know, if you're a bread firm and you go out there and buy another bread company that has a good reputation, you're going to pay more than the book value of the assets. There's nothing wrong with that. The company is worth more than the book value of the assets. But that's recognize that in Goodwill is that when you added those assets to your own balance sheet of the firm you acquired, more cash went out then physical assets came back in, so an intangible asset called goodwill is created. And then they also have a lot of these other non-current assets, which those, when I was thumbing through their 10K, there's a lot of stuff in there, such as long-term contracts with distributors and things like that. So a lot of different stuff in there, but bottom line, they're reporting a whole lot more non-current assets than current assets. And Tiffany's is more 60-40, they're more 80-20, okay? So that's one of the things that leaps out at us from the common size balance sheet. If we look at the liabilities, notice the current liabilities for both companies as a percent of assets is almost identical. In fact, that looks very, very similar. When we come down here and look at long-term debt, that's borrowing, it's a lot higher as a percent of assets over here for Flowers Foods. And so you end up with higher liabilities. Generally speaking, the big difference is they have a lot more long-term debt. That's to pay for all those long-term assets that they have. If we come down here to shareholders' equity, only about 40% of assets are funded with shareholders' equity, as opposed to 50% over here at Tiffany's. All right, so we do see some differences in there, and some of them that we would expect. Tiffany's has a lot of inventory because they have to keep a lot of that inventory laying around in a store to entice people to buy it. Flowers Foods doesn't have a lot of inventory because if you have a lot of bread laying around, it's going to go stale and go bad on you. So a lot of information kicks up when we start making comparisons using the common size balance sheet.